do so. So this particular webinar is a mindset webinar, which is going to be sort of a really big strategy in terms of retraining your actual thoughts. And I think what I'm going to do is sort of try and situate this mindset webinar within the context of the social and economic restrictions of the pandemic. So that's going to be particularly useful because I guess what I want to do is acknowledge the fact that we're all in here together. And I think a couple of months ago, for instance, we all sort of had goals to say, you know, travel interstate, and then that got canned. And then we might have had the objective to maybe sort of travel regional or coastal, and then that would have gotten canned. And then maybe over Christmas, we wanted to invite 30 or 40 people over, and then that got canned to the extent where some of us couldn't invite anyone over and others were left with only inviting 5. So essentially, the world that we're living in is kind of getting smaller and smaller. And so what used to be kind of like a colourful TV kind of world is now a bit more like a black and white sort of world. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and just recognise the fact that we're all kind of in this together. With this talk also, what I wanted to do is draw upon the work of Carol Dweck. So Carol-D-W-E-C-K. So I'll get started on her. So I'll get started on talking about her and then talking about sort of the role of unhelpful thoughts and the stories that we can sort of start to tell ourselves. So you may not have heard about some of the stuff that I'm talking about, or you may have heard it. If you have, that's all right. It's kind of really good sometimes to get a bit of a refresher and just to reinforce those lessons that we've learned from before. Alrighty, so Carol Dweck. So from her research has really come out this idea of contrasting this phenomenon called the fixed mindset with the growth mindset, right? So the fixed mindset really comes from like older style sort of research or older research that talks about this idea that the brain is set and it can't change. So this idea that we've all come with a fixed amount of intelligence, a fixed personality, and the brain doesn't change and it doesn't grow any new neurons. Now, later research, especially the research that's been spearheaded by Carol Dweck, has found that found evidence essentially for the growth mindset. So this idea that the brain is a muscle, it can flex and it can actually sort of grow. So in response to what is hard, what is difficult, in response to challenges, the brain essentially grows new neurons, new neural connections. The neurons connect with other neurons, new neural connections develop, neural pathways develop in response to learning what is hard and learning what is difficult and sitting with what is difficult and going through kind of hard sort of learning experiences essentially. So essentially the growth mindset reflects this idea that we can become smarter and we can sort of increase our intelligence. Alrighty. So what does having a growth mindset actually mean? So it means that you believe that intelligence can essentially sort of be developed. And flowing on from that is the belief that essentially you can embrace change, that you will embrace change, that you will embrace essentially challenge. You're more likely to do so. You're more likely to persist through things that are difficult. You're more likely to seek feedback from other people, to put effort in and believe that effort is the path to mastery. And you're more likely to see that feedback that you get from other people essentially as an opportunity for growth and development and learning. So when we're pushing out of this particular mindset, so to learn something new and difficult, new neurons are essentially growing in our brain, new connections are essentially growing over time, and we can get smarter. Essentially. So what Carol Dweck basically found is that students that are taught this growth mindset, like kids, school kids, that are taught this kind of growth mindset, you know, when they look at their achievement and they look at their scores, they find that those scores kind of like keep on going up and up and up compared to students that haven't learnt this growth mindset. They've also found that those students coming from low SES backgrounds, those disadvantaged kids, so they're the ones at times, they're the ones performing better academically than even the top 5% of kids in the state or in America, essentially. So let's contrast that with the fixed mindset. What does that actually look like? So this is the kind of mindset that a lot of our culture kind of speaks to. It's this whole idea of Australia's got talent, Britain's got talent, America's got talent, you know, all that jazz, right? So, you know, this idea that talent is inherent to the individual, that intelligence is fixed. And a lot of workplaces are trying to move out of this fixed mindset approach to the growth mindset. But what does it mean? It means that you're more likely to view intelligence as static. You're more likely to avoid challenges and give up easily. So there's this kind of thinking of, you're likely to think, oh, what's the point? You know, I won't get it. I'm not smart enough. If people give you feedback, you're more likely to be defensive about that feedback and think, oh, they're telling me I'm not smart enough. I'm not good enough. They're saying I'm dumb. That's why they're giving me this feedback. And you're more likely to sort of envy other people's success. So you're more likely to say, oh, just because they're talented, just because they have all the opportunities, right? So it's a really unproductive way of thinking. If we look at Malcolm Gladwell's work, actually, so he comes to mind, and he wrote this book called The Outliers. And The Outliers is a piece of work that talks about how it takes that when they look at sort of people in the top of their field, for most of them, it's taken 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to actually reach that level of mastery, right? So his book really talks about this idea that if we're looking at people in the upper echelons of their profession, they've really engaged in the hard yarns. They've taken opportunities that have presented themselves, but they've combined that with this presence of mind, this hardiness, this persistence, this doggedness, this willing to work in order to shape the world and to harness their success. So Carol Dweck, she puts it really elegantly. She looks at the growth mindset as something along the lines of the power of yet, and the fixed mindset referring to the tyranny of now. So this idea that, oh, it's a tragedy if I can't get this. It's a tragedy if I can't sort of fix this. But the power of yet, in the way in which we relate that to the current pandemic is, okay, so I'm not coping with the current lockdowns. I'm struggling a bit with this technology, but in a couple of months' time, I'm going to get there. And in a couple of months' time, we're all starting to feel a bit more comfortable. We're all starting to sort of get the hang of things. We're feeling a bit better. All right. Now, the growth mindset and the fixed mindset have implications for, there's specific consequences associated with having a growth mindset or having a fixed mindset, right? So if we look at the fixed mindset, certain thoughts can start to grow out of that fixed mindset. So these thoughts might look like things like, I can't do this. It's not worth it. It's way too hard, right? Nobody appreciates me around here, which is an unhelpful style of thinking. Now, what's interesting about this is that if you've got a fixed mindset, the thoughts that emerge out of the fixed mindset are associated, they're linked with feelings. So the way that we think is associated to the way that we feel. So if we're thinking those thoughts of, hey, nobody around here actually appreciates me, we start to feel certain things like resentment, bitterness, other thoughts like I'm not good enough, what's the point? We're starting to experience feelings of frustration, anger, sadness, right? So that directly impacts on the way that we behave, because thoughts are connected to feelings and feelings influence behavior. So what behaviors then start to emerge? If no one appreciates me around here, then I'm not going to put the effort in. No one appreciates me around here, then I'm not going to get back to them about this particular project or task because no one's going to recognize it anyway. That then has an impact on the way in which other people might see your behavior. Okay, so she's not getting back to us. Let's let her know, let's let her or him know, hey, you need more effort to be put into this particular project. Then you're going to start to think, oh, they really don't appreciate me around here. And then that creates more feelings of resentment and bitterness. So you kind of get stuck in that loop, right? Sometimes the feelings can actually sort of impact the behavior. So if you're, for instance, feeling like, oh, I'm fatigued, I'm tired, you're feeling like that physiologically, that impacts on your behavior, right? Oh, I'm not going to get out of bed. It's way too cold. That reinforces the thoughts of, oh, it's too cold, I'm lazy. Then that creates certain feelings of, for instance, you know, oh God, being upset, withdrawn, because when you're not activating energy, you're not producing, you know, the physiology that allows you to put in more energy to activate that behavior. So you know, your thoughts are like, oh, I'm lazy, it's too cold, I'm too tired. And then you start to feel even more upset and more tired, and your physiology sort of draws inward. And then that creates more behavior because your physiology is drawn inward. You're still unlikely to get out of bed. You're unlikely to create the energy to do the work. So you kind of also, again, get stuck in that loop. And then sometimes your behavior can reinforce your thoughts. So for instance, if a colleague goes into the workplace and they go in saying not saying hi to anyone, ostracizing everybody in the room, then people are going to see that behavior and respond by not saying hello. Your thoughts then might be, as the colleague might think, oh, everybody here doesn't like me. I knew I was disliked. I knew I'm not very popular. I knew I'm not a people person. That then reinforces more behavior. That then reinforces feelings of being upset, depressed, angry, bitter, irritated towards people. Then that creates more behavior of essentially not talking to people because people see that behavior and then they respond accordingly by thinking perhaps this person doesn't want anyone talking to them. And so again, you get stuck in that feedback loop. So moving on to the next slide. Yes. So the thoughts directly impact our feelings, and then these feelings can produce a range of different unhelpful behaviors in the form of distraction, opting out, substance, and can also reinforce more thoughts in the form of certain types of unhelpful thinking strategies. So if you're having that unpleasant thought of, oh my God, everybody thinks I'm dumb, or I know I'm dumb, my colleagues think I'm dumb, that's going to cause certain feelings of being upset. Then you might engage in certain strategies, for instance, to get rid of those thoughts. So to distract ourselves, we might start to have certain unhelpful thoughts, and we want to get rid of those certain unhelpful thoughts. So we watch television to manage those unhelpful thoughts. That's one behavior. That's a distraction technique. We might, for instance, opt out. So because we're having those thoughts, we then start to engage in, for instance, instead of having that conversation, we might then choose to avoid thinking about those thoughts by going to sleep. So you just clock out. You might engage in certain thinking strategies. For instance, it's all their fault. I'm thinking nobody appreciates me and recognizes me around here. Or you might start to, for instance, ruminate about the past. So, oh my God, I'm dumb, I'm not good enough. You start to think about past instances in which you can try, which you think, corroborate that belief of yours, and then you start to also worry about the future. Or if the thoughts are too horrible, you might start taking substances. You might, for instance, start to drink alcohol, have a glass of wine, for instance. So those are some unhelpful ways of dealing with unhelpful thoughts that might arise from the fixed mindset. What can we do to replace that? So there's a particular technique called diffusion. So what is diffusion? So diffusion is about disconnecting ourselves, distancing ourselves from certain thoughts and feelings. It's about taking a particular thought and viewing that thought as an oversee, right? So it's about looking at the thought as opposed to from the thought. So if I'm having the thought, I'm not good enough, I'm doing everything about here, no one's appreciating me, we want to look at it, right? Because when we look at it, we're able to recognize that we are not our thoughts, that we are separate from our thoughts, and we're able to see that little quiet space that exists between our thoughts. When we're looking from that particular thought, so we're saying things to ourselves, I'm dumb, I'm not good enough, we're becoming fused with the thought. We're becoming too attached to the thought. And it's difficult to separate ourselves from the thought and recognize that we are actually not our thoughts. So how do you look at and not from the thought? What do? You notice the thought, right? How do you notice it? You label it, you identify it. I am having the thought that I am not good enough. I am having the thought that nobody appreciates me around here. So once you notice it, identify it, the way in which we identify and label the thought, in order for us to be able to let it go, can be done or ought to be done in a compassionate and curious and kind manner. Because when we're noticing that thought in a judgmental manner, we become fused with the thought. We become frustrated with the thought. We become unable to distance and disconnect ourselves with the thought because we're attaching a lot of meaning to it, right? That's when we become sort of judgmental with the thought, right? But when we're doing so in a compassionate, curious way, it frees up that energy around the thought. It allows us to say, okay, I'm having the thought that I'm not good enough. We then place that thought on a leaf, for instance, along a stream or on a conveyor belt, and we watch that thought go away, right? And we also, because we're doing so compassionately, we recognize that the thought might come back, right? So we let it go, recognize that it might come back. And then when we do that, we're able to see that thought as one thought amongst a multiplicity of thoughts within our experience. So we recognize, we let it go, and we do so compassionately. And when we do so compassionately, curiously, we can recognize that it can come back. And that's very different from a judgmental approach, which makes it very difficult to let the thought go. Alrighty, so that's one technique. That's the diffusion technique. What's the other technique? The other technique is to identify the thought and to challenge the thought. Okay, so these are the thoughts coming from the fixed mindset. I'm not good enough, right? So the brain's not a natural cheerleader, and this is a very, very common thought to have. Common, but unhelpful. It's too hard. I can't do it. It's not worth it. All of that is coming from the fixed mindset approach. So the fixed mindset approach. So what we need to say to ourselves, if something's too hard, you're thinking, I can't do it, what do we say to ourselves? Hang on a minute. If something's a challenge, if something's hard, it means that my brain is developing the neural connections to help me work through this particular problem. That's facilitating my ability to find this particular challenge or this task easier in the future, right? So that's one way of trying to counteract that kind of way of thinking that arises from the fixed mindset. Okay, I do everything around here. Okay, so that breeds resentment. I'm a burden to everybody. What's the point? Those thoughts are very depressive types of thoughts, right? So I just wanted to make it clear that if those are some of the thoughts that you're having, it's important that you do get help, right? So go to uprise.co to get help around that. Click on get help or call Uprise 1300 209 371. So that's 1300 209 371. Or go to your GP, get a mental health plan. But it's important to get some help around that kind of really sort of depressive kind of thinking. I'm too overwhelmed. No one appreciates me around here. So again, if these thoughts, what I'd like you to do actually is just to take a moment to identify if any of these unhelpful thoughts are something that are relevant to you. Or you might be able to identify something else, something different. And if that's the case, feel free to pop them in the chat, right? I'll give everybody about 30 seconds to do that. I mean, only if you're comfortable, of course. Definitely the top three, Emma. Yeah, so just pop in, any thoughts that you find unhelpful that resonate for you, that are popping up on the slide, or they don't even have to be coming up on the slide, they can be something else, but they are unhelpful thoughts that create sort of unhelpful behaviors. Okay, so I'm overwhelmed. That's in line of the feeling. There's usually a thought underpinning that. I'm annoying to people. Okay, that's an unhelpful thought. No one appreciates me around here. I'm not loved. Okay, what's the point? I'm too overwhelmed. All right, guys, thank you so much for sharing that. That's a really useful task, especially for the next thing that we're going to have a look at, which is questioning the thought. So one strategy is to try and diffuse from the thought. The other strategy is to question the thought. So one of the things that we want to ask ourselves is this thought helpful? And one of the ways in which we can try and answer the question of whether this thought is actually helpful or not is to think about the certain feelings and unwanted behaviors that arise from that particular thought. So if you're having the thought of, I do everything around here, Catch yourself and then ask yourself, what is this thought doing? Why is it unhelpful? Well, it's making me feel bitter. It's making me feel resentful. It's causing me to engage in the behavior of snapping at people. It's not helpful because it makes me feel hopeless. It stops me from trying. It's causing me to compare myself to other people. It's holding me back. The next thought that you want to ask, the next question that you want to ask yourself is it true, right? And you're probably tempted to say, yes, it is true. Uh, what you want to do is ask yourself the question again. Do I absolutely know that it's true, right? What's the evidence that it's not true? You know, am I 100% sure about this thought? I do everything around here. Is that really the case? I may be doing the dishes and the cooking every now and then, but in my household, I can't remember the last time I did the laundry. In fact, I'm almost certain there's someone that's been doing the laundry for the past 15 years. So that's evidence that I'm really not doing everything around here. Okay, so I think it would be valuable if we just sort of took some time out for people maybe to try that exercise. You don't have to put it in the chat, but I'll give everybody around 30 seconds just to sort of pick one unhelpful thought that you've had, maybe one of the thoughts in which you identified in the chat, and then try and sort of ask yourself these questions around the thought and see if it sort of loosens things up a bit. I'll give everybody about 30 seconds to do that. So I think this is just going to be a really valuable task for you guys to sort of try on your own. So, you know, you're going to get the slides after this in the webinar video. So what you can do is like on your own, maybe sort of try this particular task, or feel free to contact, you know, a coach, a therapist to actually sort of work through some of these unhelpful thoughts with them. Okay. So now, this particular sort of approach to the way in which we're thinking, so can be used, so this growth mindset that we spoke about as an alternative way to sort of approach our thoughts is something, it's actually sort of a fantastic way and a fantastic sort of tool to try and skill to sort of try and inculcate in, for instance, people that we're around, with our colleagues, if we're in a leadership position, with our friends, with our family. So there are specific ways in which we can talk that can help encourage that growth mindset, even amongst our children, for instance. So instead of saying, you're so intelligent, instead of praising intelligence, instead of praising a person or a product, so you're so talented, you're really smart, you're so much better than others, what we want to do is praise the process. We want to praise the progress. So you want to be making deliberate comments about a person's effort, process, the strategies they're using, the perseverance, the improvement, and that's what creates the hardiness, and that's what creates the resilience. So this is what increases effort, strategies, engagement in things over a long period of time, more perseverance when nutting out those hard problems. So the word yet gives people confidence and a path into the future that creates more persistence. And you can place this in your conversations. So for instance, if you see something on TV that's impressive, it's a matter of saying, wow, they've really worked hard at that. They've really worked hard at achieving that skill. It's a result of hours and hours of deliberate practice. And it's about acknowledging someone's effort. Okay, so, you know, you've set some goals, you've worked towards your milestones on each project, you've met each milestone, you've really found another way, you've really strategized, you've worked at things one step at a time. So it's a very deliberate way of talking to people about how they're doing things and focusing on the process, the progress, as opposed to the product, as opposed to the actual person. And it's great when managing people as well, if you're in a leadership role. So it's about, I can see the effort that you've put in here. Okay, or what goal are you working towards? Let's help you work towards that goal. So remember, a very deliberate way of talking to people. So what are the takeaways? We want to work on building a growth mindset, because the growth mindset means that we can have specific consequences for our success and our outcomes. And the growth mindset is remembering that when we're doing something that's hard and challenging Our brain is plastic. Our brain is developing new neural connections that make it easier for us in the future to encounter that particular sort of challenge, right? And it allows us, knowing that our brain is sort of plastic in response to what is difficult, in response to working through and persevering what is difficult, that allows us to become sort of smarter, right? Because of the neural connections that are being developed. We want to remember to diffuse from thoughts that are unhelpful, that are arising from our fixed mindset. And the way you diffuse is by being kind, about having a kind, compassionate awareness to that thought. And we want to diffuse so we can look at, not from the thought. And we also want to encourage a growth mindset in others by praising the process and not the product or the person.